All right, so let's pick up where we left off last time. So we looked at the situation where America got itself involved in the war. Spain declared war on us with a little bit of poking and prodding from our part, um, and sort of the process by which America was prepared navy wise for the war and money wise, but maybe not army wise. And we also talked about how Theodore Roosevelt, in this desire to sort of be the man that he believed that Americans should be, resigned his position in the executive branch as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and created a volunteer Army Corps. There are there really are not a lot of battles that I'm going to have you guys have to worry about um, when we talk about the war. There's a couple we're going to look at in particular. The first one is what is probably usually regarded as the most significant battle of the Spanish American War, but at least the most significant land battle. That is the Battle of San Juan Hill. And we're going to start by looking a little bit at sort of the precursor to that, the Battle of El Caney. Now, remember, the strategy of the Americans was to blockade Santiago Harbor. And then using the Army and the Marine Corps, they were going to surround Santiago on land and basically force it to surrender. Part of the problem that America runs into is that the way that the Army was approaching the fight really was not how war was fought. Um, it was sort of, and maybe, I guess a way to look at this would be sort of like going back to the Civil War style of fighting. But even that, the the battle itself or the war itself is not like that. It really, the Spanish American War really is a reflection of what happens when you have to adapt to the situation that you're thrown in. The Americans had expected a standard sort of like big Spanish army marches out to meet big American army, bang, bang, shoot 'em up. They were not prepared for what the Spanish were doing. The Spanish had been fighting in Cuba for 30 years. They were used to guerrilla fighting. And by the way, guerrilla is okay, this is how you spell it. And this is not like the big ape gorilla. Guerrilla fighting is a term for sort of like sneaky fighting. Spain had 200,000 soldiers in Cuba, but they were scattered all over the island. The big cities had 5 or 10,000 soldiers in them. The little podunk towns had a few hundred. On the way to the big city, the U.S. passes by one of these podunk towns, a town called El Caney. There were 8,000 U.S. soldiers marching towards Santiago. El Caney had maybe 800 Spanish soldiers. The Spanish, however, had better rifles and better cannons. The U.S. couldn't do anything because they needed to get closer in order to be able to use their artillery against the Spanish. And while the Krag Jorgensen had better range and better accuracy than the Mauser Gewehr, the Krag could only get off one shot for every 5 that the Spanish could get off with the Mausers. In essence, that 800-man Spanish force had the firepower of 4,000 men. For the better part of 12 hours, this group of 800 Spanish held off the American army. The only reason why America wins, and I'm going to put that in air quotes, the Battle of El Caney, is that during the middle of the night, the Spanish army left and prepared to ambush the Americans the next day. So in the morning, America finds that El Caney is no longer occupied by the Spanish army. They declare victory and they move on. And they move on to San Juan Hill. Now, the first thing to understand here, San Juan Hill is nothing. There is no San Juan Hill. There are the San Juan Heights. They are a series of hills. This is a geographical mix-up, not unlike Bunker Hill, which was actually fought on Breed's Hill, but people didn't realize that the geography was the way that it was, so they mislabeled what the fighting was going on. There is no San Juan Hill. There is the San Juan Heights, and that's where the battle takes place. On July the 1st, so El Caney was June the 30th, July the 1st of 1898, the Rough Riders and the rest of the army are on their way to Santiago. Again, close to 8,000 American troops are ambushed by approximately 800 soldiers who occupy the high ground of the heights. Now, as Americans attempt to advance up the hill to take the hill from them, they are sitting ducks for the Spanish. The American cannons. Now, this is a picture of a reenactment scene. Okay, which is why it's in color. So notice the Americans stood out like a sore thumb with their dark blue uniforms against the grassy background. The American cannons, when these were the same style cannons basically from the Civil War, when you shot them, the recoil propelled them backwards. You had to move them back into place to reload and fire them again. And despite the fact that they were rifled, they do not have the range or the accuracy in order to hit the Spanish up on the top of the hill. And it's making things very problematic. Also problematic, notice all the smoke in this picture. The U.S. was using black powder smoke, black powder gunpowder, that produced a lot of smoke when they were firing. That smoke became problematic because not only could you not see what you were shooting at, the Spanish could very easily see where the smoke was coming from and target that smoke. The Spanish, for their part, were using these. These are the 80 millimeter Krupp family howitzer guns, and they are significantly different than the Americans. So first of all, they have longer barrels and shoot larger charges out of them. They have better accuracy and better range. They are also designed that when they fire, this barrel, the recoil mechanism attracts the barrel backwards so that the cannon doesn't move. And it's also got this metal plating here, so the guys shooting it are more or less perfectly safe. The sandbags are here to absorb any shrapnel that may come in, any of the flying dirt or debris, any bullets that come in. The sand slows down quite effectively. Now, the Americans were again pinned down. Teddy Roosevelt is riding around on his horse. He's the literally only guy on a horse. Everybody else is crawling on their belly to not get shot. And Roosevelt's up on his horse riding around. And at one point in time, the glasses got shot off of his head, which was fine. He had another pair of glasses in his hat. He sewed 10 of them in there. He pulled out another pair of glasses and he's wiping the blood from the scratching and everything on his face. He looks down to one of his guys on the ground and yells, "Isn't this the most fun you've ever had?" And they're like, "Oh my gosh, you are insane, man. What's wrong with you?" Now, this is where sort of a couple of happy coincidences occur. The Rough Riders are desperately trying to get up the hill. They are all as nuts as Teddy, although maybe not quite as nuts. Enter an American officer named Lieutenant John Parker. Lieutenant John Parker was an artillery officer, and that means that he was one of the guys in charge of, firing the cannons. The problem is that Parker's cannons never arrived in Cuba. They had been unable to transport them, and they couldn't wait for them to arrive, so they left without them. Now, it's kind of bad to have an artillery officer who's got no artillery. What are you going to do? I mean, your job is to shoot artillery. Well, in order to sort of try to make the best out of the situation, his superiors gave him another piece of artillery, the 1895 Gatling gun. Now, this is again a proto machine gun. You crank the handle here and it shoots the bullets that are stored up in here. These barrels turn in a circle. The Gatling gun, not unlike America's cannons, could not reach the Spanish on San Juan Hill. But Parker came up with a really unusual idea because he had never actually used a Gatling gun before. He read a book about them, but that's all he knew. But what he kind of looked at was, well, there are wheels on it, and it's on a carriage, and this thing's got a swivel. So he put guys on both wheels and in the back. They lifted it up, rolled the wheels, and somebody sat there shooting while they were pushing the Gatling guns up the hill. While they may not be Maxim machine guns, they were still cranking out 3,000 to 4,000 rounds a minute between all of them, and that was enough to actually stall the Spanish. Roosevelt yet out a yell, proclaimed, "It's the Gatlings, men! It's our Gatlings!" And they all, like his Rough Riders, charged up the hill. The Buffalo Soldiers, the African American unit, were the first ones to the top. They were the ones that actually captured the hill. They were the ones who put the flag up. Largely forgotten. Not necessarily on purpose. It was largely just because Teddy was such an amazing presence. Here's a picture, by the way, of the Rough Riders after they have gained the hill. This is not all of them. This is one segment of them. There's Teddy right there, looking with his glasses, looking all Teddy-like, and all the people around him. Ironically enough, the Americans discovered that at the top of the hill in a bunker were a couple of Maxim machine guns. The Spanish hadn't brought them out because they didn't feel that they needed to use them. In what may be also the worst decision ever on the part of a defending army, the Spanish attempted a counterattack on the Americans. After the Americans had gotten the Gatling set up and were firmly in control of the hill, the Spanish charged back up the hill. 90% of them never made it. 9 in every 10 guys dropped dead or were wounded. That's pretty bad. So on the first is the Battle of San Juan Hill, the battle that makes Theodore Roosevelt an American hero for his bravery, his courage under fire, and his leadership and his raw chutzpah. By the way, Lieutenant John Parker, while not as well known, his tactic of using the machine gun as a frontal assault weapon rather than artillery changed the idea of how machine guns in the future would be used. He got a medal for what he did, so you can be pretty happy for that. Now, the next day, on July the 2nd, the Army reaches Santiago. The Navy and the Marines have been in there for a while. They've been on Cuba for a month. The Navy has Santiago completely blockaded. The Army and the Marines link up and surround it by land. And the United States demands that Santiago surrender, or we will destroy it. Now, there's 10,000 Spanish soldiers in Santiago. There is most of the Spanish Atlantic Fleet in Santiago, or at least a good portion of it. Between the Army and the Marines, there's probably 8,000 or 9,000, maybe 10,000 American soldiers there. Ironically enough, only a couple of days' march from Santiago in Guantanamo are 7,000 Spanish troops that could very easily have come up, outflanked the Americans, and attacked from the rear while the Army in Santiago defended it. They didn't move because when the Marines landed in Guantanamo, they cut all the telegraph lines and nobody told the Spanish army to move out of Guantanamo. So they just sat there. Now, let's briefly talk about the issue of the Navy. So when war broke out in April, the Queen of Spain ordered the Spanish fleet to go to Cuba and engage the Americans. The leader of the Spanish fleet, Admiral Villamil, wanted nothing to do with that. Instead, he had a rather bold plan. Instead of sailing down to Cuba, he sailed straight for the United States East Coast. And for all intents and purposes, Americans believed that what he was going to do was attack the U.S. coastal cities. Now, it had maybe the desired effect. The U.S. Atlantic Fleet split into two, with part of the fleet going to blockade Havana, the other half going to intercept the Spanish fleet under Villamil. When he discovered that the Americans were on their way to intercept him, he turned around and ran away. And what ensued next are several weeks of the worst version ever of Where's Waldo? The U.S. chasing the Spanish Navy all over the Atlantic, trying to catch them. Eventually, the Spanish ran into a problem. They were out of fuel. There were plenty of coaling stations throughout the Atlantic, but the problem was is that because Spain had declared war on America, any country that had sold or given coal to the Spanish would technically have violated rules regarding war and been at war with the United States as well. And nobody wanted to do that. So there was only one place that the Spanish Navy could go to get coal. That was Cuba. The American Navy followed them, and so when the Spanish went into Santiago, the Americans simply blockaded it like the original plan and stuck them in there. And for several weeks, they had just been sitting there doing nothing. Villamil was ordered to break the blockade and return to Spain. And what he decided to do was mount a suicide run. He was going to ram the American ships in the hopes that some of his men would be able to escape. So let's look really quickly. There were 4 battleships in the Spanish Navy in Santiago. The Infanta Maria Teresa. Look at all those guns, man. And a big giant gun on the front. It's pretty epic. And a cool little carvy thing there. The Admiral Oquendo. Also, big gun on the front. The Vizcaya. This is maybe the best picture you can see as far as like all the guns on the side. Super big gun in the front. Really cool, like bridge work. An epic looking ship. The Christopher Colon or Christopher Columbus. It looks like this because it was being fixed. There were also 2 destroyers. The Pluton or the Pluto, named after the god of the underworld, not Mickey's dog, and the Führer. That's the Fury. Now, here's the problem. The Spanish had really poor quality coal. It wasn't very good as a fuel source. It required a lot more of it in order to do anything. And it was used up quite rapidly. Additionally, 4 out of every 5 shells for the giant big guns on the front were defective. They either exploded before they hit their targets, or they didn't explode at all. While these ships look super impressive, in actuality, it's a little deceptive. The armor plating that ran the ships was super thin in order to save money. And much of the ship itself was still made of wood. Nearly 30% of the entire ship was still wood. And 2 of the ships, the Christopher Columbus and the Vizcaya, their main gun was malfunctioning and wouldn't fire. And they were so loaded with barnacles, which are those weird, like little clam things that stick to the sides of boats, that it slowed the ships down. Had they just sat there in Santiago Bay and done nothing, they probably would have been okay. But they were ordered to break the blockade. And so Admiral Villamil decides that he is going to use his flagship to ram the American ships, followed by the other big Spanish battleships. They are going to open fire as best as they can, and they are going to ram the American battle cruisers in hopes that the Pluton and the Führer can actually escape. It doesn't work. In the battle, if you want to call it a battle, one American died, one American sailor. He died from heat stroke, too much sun. One American wounded. He got wounded because he was standing too close to one of the cannons on board his own ship when it fired, and he got burned by the blowback from the heat exhaust. America had one ship sunk. There's an asterisk here because we sunk our own ship on purpose. We turned it sideways and blew it up in Santiago Harbor in order to slow down the Spanish fleet. On the flip side, Spanish lose 323 men killed, 151 wounded, over 1,700 prisoners taken, and every single ship completely and utterly destroyed. This is not a battle, it is a beatdown of epic proportions. And with that, effectively, the Spanish-American War is over, at least in Cuba. Tomorrow we'll pick it up later. Peace and love.